Welcome to the Bell Curve. In the neon-drenched dreams sold by its trailers, Cyberpunk 2077 promised the future of gaming. A living metropolis where every choice echoed, every mod reshaped you, every corporation loomed eternal. What arrived in December 2020 was something else entirely, a cautionary tale that detonated publicly, expensively, and unforgivingly. No modern game has risen so high on hype, only to collapse so completely under its weight. Yet beneath the wreckage lay something unexpected, the seeds of a genuine recovery. In the years leading up to its release, Cyberpunk 2077 was treated less like a video game and more like a cultural inevitability. CD Projekt Red had earned enormous goodwill off the back of The Witcher 3, a game remembered not just for its quality, but for the idea that it represented a more principled way of making big-budget games. Cyberpunk was meant to be proof that lightning could strike twice. Night City was sold as a living, breathing metropolis, a place of excess and decay, a world shaped by corporate greed, body modification, and social stratification. Every trailer promised depth, consequence, and freedom. This wasn't just an RPG. Apparently, it was the future of the genre. Then, December 2020 arrived, and reality intervened. At launch, Cyberpunk 2077 was a contradiction wrapped in neon. On certain PCs, it functioned reasonably well. Not perfectly, but well enough that some players genuinely wondered what all the fuss was about. The visuals were striking, the soundtrack was excellent, the writing, particularly in its character work, showed real confidence. However, on base PlayStation 4 and Xbox One hardware, the game barely held together. Frame rates collapsed without warning, textures failed to load, AI systems behaved erratically or not at all, cars spawned directly in front of the player, police materialised out of thin air, quests broke, saves corrupted, the illusion of a living city fell apart the moment you stopped moving. This wasn't the odd bug, this was systemic failure. The response was swift and unforgiving. Refunds were issued on a scale rarely seen. Sony removed the game from the PlayStation Store entirely, an extraordinary move that underlined just how badly things had gone. And with it, CD Projekt Red's carefully cultivated reputation evaporated almost overnight. The narrative hardened quickly. Cyberpunk 2077 was unfinished, unfit for release, and emblematic of everything wrong with modern blockbuster development. That assessment wasn't entirely wrong, but it also wasn't the full story. Because buried beneath the technical wreckage was a game that clearly wanted to be something more. The writing had teeth. Characters like Johnny Silverhand, Panam, Judy and River weren't cardboard cutouts. They had texture, contradictions, and moments of genuine emotional weight. Side quests often carried more thematic punch than the entire main stories in other open-world games. Night City itself, even in its broken state, was compelling, architecturally dense, stylistically confident, a city that felt hostile, seductive, and utterly indifferent to the player's existence. The problem was never the vision, the problem was execution, and an apparent refusal to accept hardware limitations. Cyberpunk didn't fail because it lacked ambition, it failed because ambition went unchecked. Rather than abandoning the game, CD Projekt Red committed to fixing it, publicly, repeatedly, and at considerable cost. Over the next several years, Cyberpunk 2077 received a steady stream of patches. Performance stabilised, crashes were reduced. Broken quests were repaired, systems were refined, some features were quietly reworked from the ground up. This was not a dramatic overnight transformation. It was slow, methodical, and largely unglamorous. The sort of work that rarely generates excitement, but determines whether a game survives. As stability improved, players began to reassess what was actually there. Removed from the chaos of launch, Cyberpunk 2077 revealed itself as a far more focused experience than marketing had suggested. It wasn't a sandbox in the mould of GTA. It wasn't a full life simulator, it was a narrative-driven RPG set in an open world, not defined by infinite freedom, but by authored experiences. Once that expectation gap closed, the game began to make more sense. Combat was refined, perks became more coherent, stealth builds, netrunner playstyles, and brute force approaches all found clearer identities. The moment-to-moment gameplay stopped fighting the player and started supporting the fantasy. More importantly, the world itself felt more stable. Night City stopped glitching into absurdity and began to assert itself as a place. Still imperfect, still occasionally strange, but no longer actively hostile to immersion. The release of the Phantom Liberty expansion marked a turning point. This wasn't an apology DLC, it was a statement. A tightly written espionage story. New areas to explore, reworked mechanics, and a notable increase in confidence. Phantom Liberty didn't try to reinvent Cyberpunk, it clarified it. It leaned into what worked, strong characters, morally compromised choices, and a sense that power always comes with a cost. By this point, Cyberpunk 2077 was no longer a game defined by its launch, it had become something else entirely. Today, the game stands as a strange artifact of its time, not a triumph in the traditional sense, but not the disaster it once was. It is deeply flawed, occasionally brilliant, and undeniably ambitious. The AI remains limited, the open world still lacks certain reactive depth, some systems feel underdeveloped or abandoned, but the core experience holds. Cyberpunk succeeds where it matters most: atmosphere, character, and theme. It understands its world, it understands the consequences of unchecked power, the commodification of identity, and the illusion of choice within rigged systems. In a bitter twist of irony, the game's own development history mirrors the themes it explores: corporate pressure, unrealistic expectations, and the cost of selling a future that isn't ready. That parallel gives Cyberpunk 2077 a strange authenticity, not intentional, but earned. This isn't a redemption story wrapped in a bow, it's messier than that. Some players will never forgive the launch, and that's entirely fair. Trust, once broken, does not automatically regenerate because patches exist. But it's equally fair to acknowledge what the game has become. Cyberpunk now is a reminder that video games are not static objects. They can grow, they can improve, they can even, on rare occasions, recover from near total reputational collapse. Not because of marketing, but because of sustained effort and a refusal to quietly move on. It launched as a warning about hype, about overreach, about the dangers of believing your own mythology. It survives now as something more nuanced, a flawed, fascinating RPG that finally resembles the game it always wanted to be. Not perfect, not revolutionary, but confident enough to stand on its own merits. Night City no longer feels like a broken promise. It feels like a place scarred by its own history, which, in a cyberpunk story, is exactly how it should be.